Jesus also taught, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For He makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even tax collectors do the same?" This is the Jesus that remains silent before His false accusers. This is the Jesus that doesn't rebuke the soldiers who mock Him and taunt Him. He does not rebuke the passers-by who revile Him while He's hanging on the cross. Jesus' walk conforms to Jesus' talk. And that's why in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus has an exousia, an authority that the scribes and Pharisees don't have. But what also strikes me about the portrait of Jesus in the New Testament Gospels is that all of them agree that Jesus knew what He had to do. Paul writes that Jesus humbled Himself and became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. All of the Gospels agree that Jesus knew what was in store for Him, and yet He traveled to Jerusalem anyway. The courage of that act is often lost on 21st century readers, because we really do not understand what crucifixion is all about. Maybe we've just heard it repeated so many times. And maybe we emphasize the resurrection so much that we don't really focus attention on the crucifixion. But the simple fact of the matter is that the Gospels themselves don't tell us much about crucifixion. Mark simply says, "And they crucified Him." Kai staurosen auton. 4 words in English, 3 words in Greek. And they crucified Him. Now, Mark and the other evangelists certainly were aware of what crucifixion was all about. But because they don't describe for us that act, we haven't really known how crucifixions were carried out until relatively recently. Only about 40 years ago, a tomb in Jerusalem was uncovered, and in that tomb were the remains of one who had been crucified. And it's from those skeletal remains that we now have a better sense of how crucifixions took place. Let me just talk a little bit about crucifixion. Crucifixion was not invented by the Romans, but the Romans surely perfected it. Contrary to popular opinion, crucifixion was not intended to kill. The purpose of crucifixion was to prolong death. It was designed to bring the worst of society to the point of begging their tormentors to be put out of their misery. Also, contrary to popular belief, crucifixion did not begin at the cross. Crucifixion began with the flogging. In Mark's Gospel, Mark matter-of-factly reports this act with the words, after flogging Jesus, Pilate handed Jesus over to be crucified. Flogging was more than a severe whipping. The prisoner was stripped and tied to a post. And then a Roman centurion was responsible for carrying out the flogging. It was done with a device called a cat o' nine tails. 9 strips of leather bound together with a leather handle. At the end of each of those leather strips was a leather ball in which were embedded pieces of glass and metal. The Roman centurion would take that and would whip the person who was tied to the post. And when he would do that, it would either razor through the flesh or stick. In which case you'd have to jerk it out to get the cat o' nine tails back. And you would keep doing that, and in very short order you would lay bare the buttocks, the back, the shoulders, the stomach area, the thighs, shredded. Some people never got past the flogging. Although the flogging wasn't intended to kill, the flogging was intended to get the juices flowing. It was intended to cause people to bleed, because when you bleed severely, your blood sugar drops and your resistance drops with it. So you become more pliant. You do what others ask you to do. After the flogging, the next phase was going to the site of execution. And in crucifixions, the guilty party was required to carry their instrument of death to the site of execution. Again, contrary to popular images, it probably is not the case that Jesus carried the entire cross. The upright was probably already in place in Golgotha, the place of execution. Jesus would have carried the crossbar, something that would have been about the equivalent of a railroad tie placed on Jesus' shoulders. Your arms would be thrown over them and then lashed to the crossbar. You would then be paraded through town for all to see. This was called criminal deterrence. When people saw how you were treated, they thought twice about committing crimes in the city. You were paraded around not by any kind of direct route, but you were paraded around all through town. So all kinds of people could see you and make fun of you and the like. According to the Gospels of the New Testament, Jesus had to have someone carry his cross, not because Jesus was a wimp, but because Jesus was probably very, very severely flogged and had no strength whatsoever. Someone else carries the cross for Jesus, Simon of Cyrene, according to biblical tradition. Once you get to the site of execution, the person is thrown down on this crossbar and then attached to the cross. For many years it was believed that only Jesus was nailed. But now, in light of the skeletal remains that I talked about a few moments ago, we now know that nailing was fairly common, because there is a nail in some bones in this particular individual. And the reason the nails are still in is because they must have hit a knot in the wood and the end of it bent. So when they pulled the body off, they couldn't pull the nail out easily. So they just buried him with a nail in him. In light of the skeletal remains, we now know that it wasn't the hands of Jesus that were nailed. There are scratches on the radius and the ulna, the two bones of the forearm in the wrist area. So your arms would be thrown down on this crossbar and then nailed. They wouldn't nail directly into the flesh. They'd put a board over it and then nail through the board through your wrist.